Welcome to episode 17 of One's World. We're going to look today at Genesis again because we're going to emphasize the liminal, which I ended with last time. Okay, we're going to start there and then we're going to move on into other things. But I want to begin with Genesis because binary opposites, separation, and the liminal are crucial to the creation story and to other stories further down the line in Genesis 1 to 11. So let's start there. Let me begin with a quick recap of what I talked about in my last video. Remember, I focused on the first 3 days of creation. First day, God creates light, and then he separates light from darkness, and he alternates light and darkness. One period of light plus one period of dark equals 1 day. But between light and dark are dawn and dusk, the middle zone between light and dark. Remember, I call it the liminal zone. It's not quite light, it's not quite dark. And the end of the day is the dusk period when light turns to dark. And that's a very special time and also a potentially dangerous time. I'm talking about not having thieves and robbers come out, although that may be true, but I mean emotionally or intellectually, cognitively, a potentially dangerous and potentially powerful time. Mary Douglas, who I mentioned also last time, talks about the power and the danger of those places that are not quite one thing, not quite the other. The second and third day are very important because they define 3 zones through binary opposition. Second day, God creates up and down. He's got water above, water below, with the firmament, the sky, and so you've got the sky and down below, and then on the third day he separates water and dry land. And now you have 3 zones: oceans, dry land, sky. And then on the next 3 days, he populates those zones. And here also becomes crucial to understand that anything that occupies its zone properly is clean, and everything that either moves between zones, with one exception, anything that moves between zones or anything that doesn't fit in its zone quite right is not clean. So, for example, frogs are not clean because they don't stay on the dry land and they don't stay in the water. They go back and forth. Birds that don't fly are unclean because birds are supposed to occupy the sky, but instead they walk on the ground. So they act like land animals instead of sky animals, so they're unclean. Lobsters are unclean because they don't swim in the sea. They walk on the ground at the bottom of the sea. So they act like land animals, except they're in the sea. And so like the ideal sea animal has fins and scales. And if it has fins and scales, then it's sitting in its sea perfectly. It's not walking. It's not being like an oyster, just kind of clumped onto something and not moving at all. It's doing its job. And the proper land animal has a cloven hoof and it chews its cud. That means that it eats grass and leaves, and so it is clean. It walks properly. Why a split hoof is the way to walk properly, I don't know. But split hoof chews its cud, that it doesn't eat carrion, it doesn't eat other animals, it eats grass and leaves, and therefore is clean to eat. And so you have these three zones, and anything that's liminal is potentially dangerous, but also potentially powerful. Animals that cross over are dangerous, but places that cross over can be both dangerous and powerful. Now think again about the three zones. Let's just take earth and sky as our first example. What sits between earth and sky? Yeah, mountaintops. Mountaintops are not on the ground fully, they're not in the sky fully, they're in between. Or sea and dry land, then you have the seashore, or the beach if you like. It's not quite sea, not quite land. And it's no great surprise that very important religious actions in both the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible take place either at the top of mountains or on the edge of seas or lakes. So, for example, Moses was given the Ten Commandments and the law on the top of a mountain, Mount Sinai. Jesus delivered his most famous speech in Matthew at the top of a mountain, the Sermon on the Mount, and so on. So we need to explore that a little more fully now. Now, I am not being deliberately liminal with my camera work. I'm using the Capture app in my editing software because my microphone, my video camera is not working right now, and it's a holiday in Cambodia, and my camera shop where I go to get things repaired is closed, so I'm gonna have to be liminal. It's not bad. I kind of like the image. So anyway, I'm going to look at two stories from that first part of Genesis, that is Genesis 1 to 11. 12 to 50 is a completely different kind of enterprise. It's a series of longer sagas about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. But the first 11 chapters are much shorter and pithier stories, the stories like of the fall, Cain and Abel, and a slightly longer one, which I'm going to emphasize a little bit now, the flood, that does take several chapters, and the Tower of Babel. Let's start with the Tower of Babel. Now, I said that there's a liminal place between earth and sky that is mountaintops, and that's okay. Moses went up a mountain kind of to meet God halfway, if you like. You know, God could come down to the mountaintop and Moses could go up to the mountaintop. So they met halfway. They met in that liminal zone. And importantly, that liminal zone was not a place where all the other Israelites were just clamoring to go up. No, no. That's just for the holy ones. We'll stay down here. Thank you very much. But then some people wanted to build their own mountains. Now, in Judah, you've got natural mountains, including Mount Zion, and on the top of Mount Zion, the people of Judah built several temples. The first one, normally called the Temple of Solomon. This all gets very, very complicated, and I'm not going to talk about it right now. But anyway, the holy place in Jerusalem is Mount Zion, and on Mount Zion was two temples at least, and now the remains of the second temple, called the Wailing Wall, are still there. There's a mosque where the temple used to be. Anyway, those are all stories for another time. But this is what the people of Judah were used to. They were used to a natural mountain, building a temple on top of the mountain as the sacred place. But in plains such as Babylonia, where there weren't any mountains, the Babylonians built what were called ziggurats, sort of pyramid structures, if you like. And at the top of the ziggurat, they placed a small temple or bedroom. I mean, there are a lot of different things about it, but the idea was that the Babylonians didn't have mountains where they could meet God, so that they could build mountains of their own. And the Judeans looked at this and thought it was blasphemous that to meet God you had to go up something natural. You couldn't build something and expect to find God at the top. The Babylonians did think that they could meet the gods, plural, at the top, and in fact, some of the ziggurats had bedrooms at the top so that the emperors could have sex with female goddesses at the top of the ziggurat. That's also a long story, but the point is that the story of the Tower of Babel, and Babel actually in Hebrew is simply Babylon. This is the Tower of Babylon, and the argument is that building your own liminal zone is catastrophic, that liminal zones are dangerous as it is, but if you build one yourself, then you're courting disaster. And so when the people of Babylon started building their ziggurat towards the heavens, to make this liminal place where they could meet the gods, God was not happy. And so he made them separate more and more and more by giving them multiple languages. That's just a fairly simple version. The more complex one that I want to talk about is the flood. Now, the flood story shows up in multiple Mesopotamian sagas, including the Gilgamesh and quite a few others. And biblical scholars talk about whether they're the same or different. I'm not going to get into that particular argument. What I do want to talk about is why God was so angry that he created a flood. Now, first of all, I will admit that this story doesn't originate in Judah. It's impossible. Judah is mountainous, it's dry, there's a lot of desert wilderness. They don't get a lot of flooding. And if they do, the water drains off. In the plains, in the Mesopotamia, the area between Tigris and Euphrates rivers, you do get flooding. And so the story of a universal flood or a very big catastrophic flood is much more likely to come from Mesopotamia than it is to come from Judah. But what interests me is the reason that God sends the flood. And in Genesis, it's peculiar. And the story is not usually told. People rarely remember it. It doesn't get recited in church very often. But before the flood, Remember, there are a lot of things that people did that were not particularly good, like Cain killed his brother. And God didn't kill Cain because he was a murderer. In fact, he protected him. He put a mark on his forehead, now called the mark of Cain, and exiled him. So, I mean, he punished him, sure, but he didn't kill him. Adam and Eve weren't exactly completely honest and loyal. I mean, they disobeyed God and they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, but they too were not destroyed. But people did something really, really, really bad so that God said, okay, I've had enough. I'm killing everybody except Noah and his descendants. Everybody's got to die because they're just horrible. And you have to wonder, what's worse than murder that God would be so upset? And that's where this little portion at the beginning of the flood story comes in, and it just gets ignored. The story says there was a time when the members of the court of heaven, and they're given different names, but let's just say like angels, people who lived with God in heaven, looked upon women and saw that they were fair. And so they came down from heaven and had sex with these women. And the women had children. And these children were, technically they're called Nephilim, or sometimes in the English translation they're called the giants, the mighty men of old. So this is not very different from Greek tales of Zeus and all of his various heavenly court or Olympic court having sex with humans and giving birth to demigods. That's what Genesis says happened at one point, that angels or heavenly beings came down to earth, mated with women, and gave birth to a race of mighty giants. And God didn't like it. And then so he sent a flood to kill off everybody. So, if you want to put it simply, when two things mix that are not supposed to mix, it potentially undoes all of creation. Because what God does to send the flood is he lets loose all the water above and the water below. He lets it all come down and come up and gets rid of the distinction between the sea and the dry land and above and below. He undoes creation. The only day he doesn't undo is day one. So there's still the revolution of night and day, but everything else is destroyed. He's undone creation because what had been separate, that is, heavenly beings and earthly beings, had been combined, and that this was a great sin. In other words, the great sin of all time is to mix things that God has separated. So that is the liminal mixing of two things that are opposite. As far as God is concerned, is too powerful and too dangerous and cannot exist. So now I would like to move away from Genesis to humanity in general, and we'll make the, I don't think, particularly peculiar claim that when we create opposites, we also create the liminal. And the liminal is always unusual in some ways. sometimes dangerous, sometimes powerful, sometimes both. Depending on the opposites, depends the power and the danger. So, for example, when we distinguish black and white, then we'll always say, well, there's a gray area. Well, the gray area I don't think is necessarily very dangerous in most cases or very powerful in most cases. But it does exist when we say good and bad. We like to make those distinctions, and we have a gray area in between where things aren't necessarily good or necessarily bad. And we're not talking about a particularly powerful or a particularly dangerous liminal zone. So let's be clear. Opposites are human creations. We make the opposites, and then we make the middle ground, the liminal zone, in between them because we've made the opposites. And depending what the opposites are, depends the power of the liminal zone. Why we create particular opposites is a very long and complicated subject, and I'm not going to go into it now. But it is a function of language. We have to make distinctions in order to have vocabulary at all. If we had just color terms that represented every single possible color, we'd have infinite color terms, but we don't. We say, well, there's red, and there's blue, and there's green, and there's yellow. There's all different kinds of reds, there's all different kinds of blues, or different kinds of reds, greens, scarlet, cotton yellow, there are all kinds, but we still keep our inventory of vocabulary words for color limited because we can't have an infinite number of words just for color. We have to limit ourselves. Because we do that, then we end up sometimes with these binary oppositions, which don't necessarily reflect the natural world, but they do reflect the way we think. Now, where it becomes critically important is when we're talking about humans. And of course, there's one binary opposition that is pretty clear, and that is male and female. And there's two ways to think about this. We can think about it in terms of sexual organs, and I will call that sex. So in other words, an individual with a penis is male, and an individual with a vagina is female. And for the most part, we don't have a lot of problems with that binary opposition. But there are a few individuals that have both organs. And so in many cases, if they're born that way, doctors and parents together will decide which organs to keep and raise the child with one or the other. But there is a liminal possibility, and people get upset by that possibility because they want male and female to be absolutely clear, distinct, one-of-a-kind sexes. But then there's also what we call gender, and I'm going to have a lot to talk about that in the next video. But for now, I just want to focus on male and female physically. What happens is that the physical attributes of male and female become associated with character traits, and that then moves from sex into gender and is a mistake. Not all people who are physically male have culturally male characteristics, and not all people who are physically female have culturally female characteristics. That's what I want to talk about in the next video. What I want to talk about now is what Leslie Fiedler in his book Freaks described as freaks, and he took the title from a movie, a cult movie of the same name. And what he argues is that people are called freaks because they are liminal, because they blur distinctions that we want to make distinct. For example, individuality. We want to say that every individual is distinct. Well, conjoined twins are liminal. We used to call them Siamese twins because the first conjoined twins were from Siam. They're now called conjoined twins. And if you look at this photo, you can ask, is this one individual or is this two individuals? They've got, in a sense, one body and they share a lot of organs, but they've got two heads. So is it one individual or two? It messes up our own heads. We can't decide whether we've got one or two. Should this pair of conjoined twins vote twice or once? It screws with our idea of what an individual is. And the one I want to focus on to lead us as a segue into next time about male and female is the bearded lady. Here's a classic bearded lady from the 19th century who is functionally female, but grows a beard, a full beard, a beard better than a lot of men can grow. So it screws with our idea of what male and female should be, because females should not grow full beards like this. It makes us question our cultural values. What does it mean to be male? And what does it mean to be female? And the point I want to stress over and over and over is that there is a fundamental difference between what it means physically to be male or female and culturally what it means to be male and female. And those important differences, that what it means physically to be male and female is universal. What it means to be culturally male or female varies from culture to culture, and even the specifics within a particular culture, such as our own, can be highly varied. That is, we can talk about a man's man, and the man's man usually is somebody like Bruce Willis in Die Hard, like really tough and really strong and really persistent. And a girly girl, and note we say girly girl, not woman's woman usually, because the female has a diminished cultural capacity according to Western culture. So a girly girl is pretty and weak and dependent on the male, and so on and so forth. And next video, I'm going to look at male and female from a gendered point of view, not from the sex point of view, but from the point of view of how culture views male and female and what it means to be male and what it means to be female. And what the problem is with people who confuse those categories. That is a man who likes to be nurturing and caring and kind, which are characterized as female characteristics, or a woman who joins the army and is tough and rough and fights hard and drinks hard and does all the macho things. I want to talk about the effect that has on culture. But for now, I would like you to like and subscribe, hit the subscribe button, and I will see you next time.